Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This is Ask the Expert with Dr. Thomas Broussard, who will be chatting with us about his book, The ABCs of Aphasia, A Stroke Primer, and also about how we can all contribute to aphasia awareness. I'll be your host. My name is Jen. I'm part of a team at the National Aphasia Association, a nonprofit organization dedicated to advocating for people with aphasia and their families. I've got our panelist, Dr. Thomas Broussard, with us, who I will be introducing shortly. But first, I want to mention that we've already received some great questions that have been submitted over the past few weeks about aphasia awareness. If you have any questions during today's session, please feel free to enter them into our Q&A chat at the bottom of your screen, or the regular chat is fine too. We will try our best to answer as many of those as we can. So in today's National Aphasia Association Book Club today, one of our hosts described today's panelists as wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And I couldn't agree more. Dr. Thomas Broussard is a 3-time stroke survivor and the author of 4 books about stroke and aphasia, with another one coming our way pretty soon. He has contributed to hundreds of articles and presentations. He has had a distinguished career serving as an assistant dean at the Heller School at Brandeis University, and is currently known as the stroke educator, traveling across the country as part of his aphasia awareness campaign. Dr. Thomas Broussard, thank you so much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you, Jen.
How many states have you spread your message across to?
30 states so far.
That's amazing. Which one is your favorite?
Favorite?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the one I was going most to was Florida, because I lived in Florida.
Oh, nice.
Now that I'm in Maine, I think I'll be going here a lot.
Is anyone in our audience from Florida or Maine? Let us know in the comments.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So I'm going to hand it off to Tom now, who will talk to us about his book and his mission, and then we'll come back together for some questions.
All right, sounds good. So now we'll share. Make sure that this is all working. Nope, go back to that. Have to get my little, nope, go back to that. I want to get my pointer working so I can actually point at stuff. All right. Thanks for coming today, everybody. My name is Tom Broussard. I think probably most of the people here are people I know, so I do appreciate your coming here today. It was great to get asked to talk about, quote, my book, not so much about the book really, as much as why I wrote the book and why I am using it as a tool for all of us in terms of aphasia awareness. So that's how we're really going to talk about this, is the call to action for aphasia awareness. And my book happens to be one of the many things we have to do to continue to create more awareness for the wider public, as well as, especially because of the healthcare community and hospitals, who also need a lot more work about really fully understanding about aphasia. My first stroke was almost 10 years ago. It'll be 10 years ago this coming Sunday, which is a big day in our household. There'll be a lot of activity going on. Because after 10 years, you just sort of worry you're not going to have more. When you have a stroke, you worry about having a stroke, until I had my 2 TIAs. And that gave me a whole new perspective on having one stroke is one thing, other strokes in the same person, then you get this additional perspective. But in this particular case, that was where I fell down on that street in Waltham, Massachusetts, 10 years ago. My wife dragged me from that pole where I had crawled to. She helped push me, pull me, drag me to the CVS and the pharmacy in the back. That's what this is. And she threw me in that chair and called 911. We were lucky. It was 8:30 at night. I got to the hospital within an hour. So they had plenty of time to check me and see if I could use TPA, which is the big drug that is used with people with aphasia if you have ischemic stroke. And I got it. I got it, but without knowing that although it relieved me of my bodily issues, I had aphasia and didn't know that at the time. But that is my neuro ICU you see there. And a couple hours later, they moved me to a new room at that hospital. So the stroke was on Monday. I was discharged on Saturday. And really, this, as I say here, this is the important part that really is important. When I was discharged, and not that I knew anything, right? Meaning there was an SLP who assessed me on Thursday. I didn't know that she was there. I didn't know what this was. I didn't even know there was a human there with me. So awareness is a big, big issue, not only awareness about aphasia, but just awareness of your life after a stroke. So I had the assessment done, but I still had no idea that I had an assessment done, other than my wife telling me that that was the case. But the important part was here that really led me to write this book, the ABCs, is that particular piece of paper, and that's the original, that's the only thing I got at discharge. That was it. They told me it would take about a month for my brain to settle down, and that's pretty much what it took, about a month. And they gave me a prescription to go to a local rehab hospital outpatient a month later. But this piece of paper was it. It's not like I could read it anyway, but my family had to read this and start understanding what this word called aphasia is. The only really another good part is that the National Aphasia Association was there as one of the helpful links going forward. But this is how I really started to understand later years what needed to be here, not a one piece of paper, but something else that could help propel people with stroke and aphasia going forward over time, for sure. Now, this little thing here, trying to make it go forward.
Oh, Tom, I think you can use your arrow key on your keyboard.
Yeah. Yeah, this little thing here, yeah, it just has a mind of its own, I'm afraid. A lot of information here and packed in one slide, but I'll go through it fairly quickly. It took me about 4 years to have this conversation. And at that point is when I had decided I would write a book, at least a book. I never thought I'd write another book, but my doctor had told me, because I was saving all the evidence of my recovery, because I did keep a diary. Many of you know that, but I kept a diary without knowing that what I was writing didn't make any sense. But a 500-page diary means you're doing a lot of, quote, work. And it turns out that all the work is what induces plasticity. That that is part of how I got better, because it's the act of writing. It didn't matter how bad it was. The act of writing induced more plasticity. And that allowed me to get better going forward. So I started writing my first book, and then I realized I could write another book and another book and another book. So the first one really is the primer, and that ends at 11 months when I finally became aware. I actually had another epiphany in my head, another click, and realized that awareness was coming in and unawareness was leaving. And I wrote as fast as I could, because now I could see with my own eyes for the first time that I could see how bad it was. I looked at the first entry. It was awful. And now I could tell it was awful because I've been reading it for months. It looked fine to me. But at that moment in time, I could feel it happening. And I wrote down 15 pages as fast as I could, telling, quote, the world, with new eyes, I can now see what I couldn't see before. And then I continued to write for another year. That became the 500 pages. But that is the primer. The secret was the next step, when I began to understand that it is all about the doing. When it comes to the activities that all of us do in terms of reading, writing, and speaking, any number of cognitive activities, every single one of those things are active based. They are active verbs. And if you do more of those, you will induce more plasticity. Not that I knew, nor many of us know, what aphasia would look like or how plasticity would work, but it does turn out that the activities themselves is what moves us forward. And then the last book, this series so far, are a bunch, 34 chapters about metaphorical stories of what was happening along the way. But at that point, here with what is now called the white paper, for those of you who do work with aphasia research, the white paper by Nina Simmons Mackey. She wrote, and I bought it. Back then it was $100, so I bought it. Now it's probably less. And realized, as it says here in yellow, the insufficient awareness of knowledge of aphasia in the healthcare providers and the wider public. That's the #1 gap. And at that point, I figured out, oh, maybe that's part of why I only got that one piece of paper. It was this call to action by Nina that said, basically, Tom and everybody else, this is a call to action. We must do these activities, whatever they might be, that will help people learn more about aphasia nationwide. So the next year, I wrote a paper, and I presented in Boston in 2019. And you see there, as I say, recently updated, 20 of the now 23 hospitals do not provide any information, online information about aphasia on their website, including one of those hospitals in Florida, where I was a volunteer for 8 years, met every year, had presentations at that hospital, met with the president several times, actually showed it to him on my website, on my laptop, on his website, and said, here's it is for you. And I put in aphasia, literally it comes out and says, we're sorry, no results were found at his hospital. How can that possibly be? Because you had SOPs there. Everybody knows what aphasia is, but the lexicon of aphasia still hasn't made its way into the lexicon of hospitals more generally. And that is when I wrote that article here, understanding just how many hospitals I've been to around the country. When I go to visit, I always call ahead and say, you guys should check all your hospitals around you and find out that some of the biggest hospitals, some of the biggest in their state, has the same answer. We're sorry, no results were found. Big states still have that issue. So last year, I was writing my 4th book of the series and put that aside and decided to write this book for that very purpose. It was during COVID, so we couldn't go out anywhere. I started in January, published it in May. For that exact purpose is to basically supplant the one piece of paper that I and others likely get, and at least go with the family having in their hand, other than the years it takes you to really understand about aphasia. You get that one piece of paper, you have to look up aphasia. You'll finally find our organization, the National Aphasia Association, but it takes a long time, since most of them don't even know what it means, right? Can't hardly pronounce it. So this is really plugging the gap, as I say, helping people better understand why this is a tool. The book was written on purpose. I couldn't see, since I couldn't read, I could see images. And if I read the images, I say reading the images, that's the way I was writing in my diary. I would write in my diary, writing, using graphs, charts, and metaphorical drawings that make a lot of sense, but the words make no sense. I didn't know any of that. Everything looked fine to me, but as an engineer for 20 years, I would always write with drawings. And when it came to learning things, since I couldn't read, I could see these images and I could metaphorically understand. So if I saw the brain with a Broca's area, I go, oh, that's the brain. That must be where I had problems. For me, it happened to be in the Broca's area. It could have been any number of other places, never mind how severe it could have been. So I wrote this based on the images themselves. So now, without knowing anything, you can look at, and of course you can't see some of these images, most of these images, but you can start to see, oh, I can understand metaphorically why that one there is sweeping out the clot, the Broca's area in the brain, what a neuron looks like, like a little critter. The brain with barn gels, building up strength, as it were, which is really what plasticity does. So images and short titles, and eventually move into understanding 2, 3, 4 words, and then a sentence and a paragraph. The next step of all this was to provide, and again, I did this knowing that I would never know until later. It has to be the family. When I donate these books in Florida, they would call me because I was there for such a long time. They would call me that day if there was a stroke, and I would be there the next day. I would meet the person. We wouldn't know each other, so I wasn't concerned about that as much as because they were taking care of him or her, but the family was there and they're desperate to find out what's going on. And I would give them this book as well as other books because they needed something, even if it took them many more months to actually put it in their hand and start reading it. They had it in their hand, as opposed to now, for the first time in your life, you have to go figure out how all this is going to work for you and everybody else in your family. So I wrote the second part there, the research materials, as now all of us can see the card magnets, the white paper information there, our ID cards. Unfortunately, still an awful lot of people still do not use ID cards. And that is also incredibly important, not only for us, but it turns out that when we use our ID cards, it also helps educate that wider public because they too have no idea. But many people are very kind and patient. And when they get what I used to have, and that happens to be mine, and that's the original, it was on a card. We called it a worry card in Boston because when you had to take this to a restaurant, we were so scared. I would just be so worried, and I'd give it to them and they would use it, and they would take me aside and say, okay, Tom, what is it you want for a meal? Of course, I told them I'll eat anything. Just give me the money. Just give me the food. I'll give you the money. So these ID cards are very helpful, and the American Aphasia Association has that little app there, so you can go get it yourself and print it out, which I do all the time, and hand it out to a lot of people. So that too is very important. And then the last one too.
Can we put a quick pause there and do a little poll? Because I'd like to see how many people in our audience actually have an aphasia ID card. So you should be able to see on your screen a little poll pop up. Do you have an aphasia ID card? Yes, no, I do not have aphasia.
Oh, cool.
We almost have full participants. Let's see if we can get everyone voting.
That's pretty cool.
Let's go for 10 more seconds.
Sure.
Okay, so it looks like 48% do have an aphasia ID card, 42% do not, and then about 10% of the people in our audience do not have aphasia. I'll be putting a link in our chat to find the printable version of an aphasia ID card from the National Aphasia Association.
Very cool.
Back to you, Tom.
Thank you, Jen. That's great. Excuse me. The last thing there is the caregivers. Obviously, it starts with a person with stroke and aphasia, but the caregivers are right behind them, care and family givers right behind them. So again, the National Aphasia Association has that guide, another great place to go to. So again, this all is very helpful for somebody who doesn't get anything other than that one piece of paper. The website resources, also very important. 22 the top people in the country with stroke and aphasia, and then a recovery plan, which again, a lot of people don't get a plan when you are discharged from your therapeutic sessions. And then a glossary with many other definitions that you will never know until you work your way all the way through the images, the title, more information, and a year or two or three later, you get to understand some of this material as well. The entire response, as it were, if this is my response to the call to action from Nina, the entire response and the call to action is to plug the aphasia awareness gap. And anything and everything we can do is all part of what we need to do. It turns out that we are in a bubble, meaning all of us are in a bubble. If you are in the aphasia world, typically that's how we find out about aphasia, is because we have it ourselves, stroke and aphasia ourselves. So it turns out we're in this bubble, and there's 7 or 8% of the people who know something about aphasia, and the rest do not know. I watched a presentation today with another researcher, and she started out telling us, basically telling us what I'm now telling you, with a nice slide there about the white paper and the National Aphasia Association. Yes, 7% plus do not are the only ones who know something about aphasia. The rest do not. And she in her own world, who I've never met before, talking about the fact that this is a big issue. People just don't know about it. And actually using the ID card is also very important therapeutically for us, as well as those who are listening to those with aphasia. So I say use this tool. This is written for this exact purpose for the person with aphasia as well as their family. But then too, it can be used with educational with their hospitals who really clearly do not know. They know about aphasia. At that hospital that I went to, when I asked a nurse about it, she goes, "Oh, we know about aphasia." She went and got her computer and got online, said, "This is what it means." I said, "No, do you have any literature? Do you have any piece of paper? Do you have a book, something to give a person with stroke and aphasia?" No, and it's not on their website. So we have to use that book. It has to be in the hands of every single person. I've been donating my book, the ABCs, to several hundred books to about a dozen states. I give it to them. I give it to the president. He or she gives it to the SLP, and then they use it to hand them out. As they run out, they call me and say, "Okay, Tom, where do I get more?" I say, start a little budget line at your hospital. Get 20, 30, 40 and use it for that. I mean, it's an incredibly small amount of money, but you need something in their hands. Otherwise, we are still not plugging the gap. We are not doing that unless we do this. And what I'm doing is just one piece of it. There's a lot of other people, as if Nina was the general or the admiral, and she had said, "Come, follow me," and we have to follow her. And I'm not sure if we're following her. We have to do this work. And putting that book in their hands is one small part, but it's an important part. Donating, as I say, working on that as best I can to find resources to have them provided. We have to educate the healthcare system, and that means any number of people. One of our friends, Barbara, made a presentation the other day at one of her facilities, and that is how it really works. You just have to go in there and talk the best we can about what the experience is about a person who had stroke, aphasia, lost their language, and got it back in any number of ways. But educating the system is a big system to be educated about. And I know with COVID, it's no time to be stressing the system, which is already stressed to the max. I understand that completely, but you still have person one-to-one conversations, and even that continues to be how we're going to make this gap narrow. And we definitely have to teach the wider public about aphasia in every possible venue, whether it be hospitals, churches, military, business, nonprofit. Every venue you can possibly imagine is any place you can go. Go to the grocery store, find the general manager, go in there, as I did, bring all this stuff, explain it to him, and goes, "Oh, sure, we do this kind of stuff all the time." And they will give you a table. You can sit there and talk about it and hand out a card from the National Aphasia Association, any way you can possibly imagine. I did that at Staples. I forget, it's in one of my articles. I think 600 and some people came through that door. I greeted everyone. It was an all-day affair, and handed out our card, meaning the National Aphasia Association, because I printed a whole bunch of them out for them. So any way you can do it, that is how we can make this happen. But all of us have to be, as I say, following Nina going forward. And then I say the last one there, utilize the perspective of people with aphasia more, like Barbara, like Jennifer, like many other people, both inside and outside the bubble. Because if we're only in the bubble, we will never get to the 98% that are in other bubbles that we still have no real reason for getting to them, other than leading them to understand that when it comes to stroke and aphasia and plasticity, how we, quote, get better, plasticity works whether you're healthy or not. So all of the educational community too must understand about plasticity in the same way all of us learned when we were in 3rd grade about photosynthesis, right? We all know that, converting light into green leaves. Plasticity converts thought and cognitive activities into new brain matter. neuromatter. That's how we grow with the remaining cells we have. So an awful lot of that goes into education by learning how using the way to get into that through understanding about stroke, aphasia, recovery, and plasticity. And oh yes, when you want to learn a new language, a new skill, a new job, it requires plasticity on a moment-to-moment basis going forward. So that is how this call to action has started. And that's it for now. Now we have questions, and I'll unshare.
Thank you so much for that, Tom.
Thank you.
It was really inspiring to hear your story, and of course, at times upsetting to hear what your experience was like when you left the hospital. But we're glad so many great things came out of it, because now we have our Johnny Appleseed of Aphasia Awareness, which is Tom's Tom's phrase, not mine. I stole that one. I liked it so much. So we had a great question in our chat. Have you read Hope After Stroke by, oh, I'm going to butcher this name, Sigourney Tansman, MACCCSLP.
Hope After Stroke.
Hope After Stroke.
I think I've seen it, but no, I haven't read it.
Are there any book recommendations that you do have?
Any recommendations for me?
Mm-hmm.
In the last couple of last year or so, what I think is important, I just happened to brought this with me. Just happened. Every single time a person writes a book about stroke and aphasia, it's like the angel gets his wings, right? Every time somebody writes a book, somebody learns something about it, right? No matter what it is. So over the quote years, I typically end up buying a lot of those books. And recently, so I'm just going to show you some. So this is another one, The Amazing Liz. Everybody should get this book. Why? Because it's written by a person with stroke and aphasia out of the Boston area. And she has done a lot in terms of making people, and then you can see it. She actually says from A to Z, right? She wrote that at about the same time as my book. It just so happens that we both use that A to C metaphor. So that's another good book. Here's a new one, just came out literally this month, from another person with stroke and aphasia, terrible time, did very, very well. He wrote this book as a poet. So this too is very important. So I know there's so many books out there. I'm going to show you this one too. A Vietnam vet, he wrote this book, right? And of course, this one here, most people have seen this recently, Identity That, and you're going to see her as on one of the expert presenter in a couple of weeks. So yes, you can continue to read them all. What I'm trying to do is get to know the authors and asking them if they will join. I'll say me, since Nina's not here. When we charge that heel, it's one thing to write the book, it's another to take the next step in terms of continuing to educate the wider public. So yes, most of these people are joining my crusade, as it were.
Thank you for that. Tom, we had a question about your book. Do you think that it can be translated to different languages for different countries? And how would that begin? How would that
sounds good.
Start?
Yeah, one of these days, wouldn't that be fun? But who knows what's really going to happen in the future? But the more I can get the United States to know about my work, then sure, eventually it'll make its way into other countries as well. But yeah, some other time.
We have some more questions in the chat. So one of our attendees mentions that writing was good for you. Do you have any information on transcranial magnetics?
No, not other than what I've read.
That's definitely a question that we can bring up in some more Ask the Experts, because everyone has a different opinion on it. So we'll definitely keep that on our list of questions to ask.
Sure.
Another question from the chat. I'm curious why Tom only started rehab 1 month after stroke rather than immediately.
The that too, since every stroke is completely different, like a snowflake, really, and also the environment within which you are sitting has an awful lot to do with what you're going to do next. So clearly I was healthy enough to go home. If I had been not healthy enough, either I would have stayed at that hospital and they would have started doing some amount of therapy, or if I moved from that hospital to a more long-term rehabilitation facility, I would have gotten more, quote, therapy. So it always fits into how you fit going forward. So I was able to go home. I don't know when I started doing PT. I didn't start OT until I started with my SLP, but I also had PT too. And I don't know if that started before, but they had told me it was going to take a month. And literally for 2 weeks, I didn't know what today or tomorrow was because I happened to take some pictures, and I only knew much later when I took one picture, thought that's today, took another picture, I thought that was tomorrow, and it was 2 weeks later. So for 2 weeks, I had no idea. So yeah, it does take a while before you settle down enough.
Thank you for that. Another question in the chat. What about an audiobook?
The Kindle is on Amazon, but an audio, that would be another leap forward, as it were. So resources is always the issue. So yeah, for someday. I do an awful lot of work, but not a lot gets out there because it still continues to be just this one person. But yeah, in the days to come, I'm coming up on 70. I'm very excited about becoming 70 years old. And then I figure another 10 years. It's been 10 years since the last 10 years, I figure the next 10 years, I hope I can continue to do what I'm doing and become 80. Of course, we're always hoping. And then go on after that, but
There's another comment that says you can also use Apple's text-to-speech function. I think Google also has a function like that. Okay, so some questions from our Q&A chat. Are you non-fluent or fluent?
Well, that's interesting. I guess fluent, if that is something that you understand.
So maybe do you want to go into the difference between non-fluent and fluent aphasia?
Yeah, we'll ask Darlene when she comes up for the next presentation.
Sure.
When I had aphasia and I was told I had expressive aphasia, well, on the inside, hearing that word, it sounded like, oh, that means I can talk. And say, no, receptive is I can't understand. Expressive means I can't say. But when it says the word expressive, from me on the inside, especially at the beginning, I had no idea what those things really meant. So when they said I was fluent or non-fluent, I kept saying, I really don't understand that really means, because I think I can speak fine. But on the outside, they could tell that I wasn't speaking fine. And until I recorded myself for 2 years and then had them transcribed, and then I could listen to what I was saying, then I could see myself why I was still making these mistakes, still being as fluent as I was with words that still didn't make the words I wanted them to be. So it's difficult for somebody who doesn't know the lexicon of aphasia until after you live with it for a few years.
I just want to share this graphic from the National Aphasia Association's website. It talks a little bit about the different types of aphasia. So if you're interested, you can always find this on aphasia.org/graphic-assets, and then another slash. Another question we had, sorry, I will put that in the chat. Another question we had is, I have aphasia and I talk slow. You are fast. Why and how?
Yeah, why and how? It's it all has to do with those particular cells that were destroyed and how they translate into the symptoms you now have versus what I now have, and the severity, meaning how many cells were destroyed at those particular places using those particular activities that provide me with speaking faster and you speaking slower. So I think that's how it ends up being. And then continued practicing. I used to speak fairly quickly before. Now, unfortunately, I speak very fast now and end up tripping over myself. So I have to keep telling myself to go slower, especially when making a presentation like this. Otherwise, I'll trip over myself.
Thank you. And so after your first stroke, when you first came out of the hospital, how was your speech? Was it also fast or?
I don't know. I had no conscious awareness of what my voice sounded like. It was a month, about, 4 or 5 weeks later, I started recording myself, and then I could listen. Those, like I mentioned too, those first 2 weeks, I didn't know anything. The next 2 weeks, I was getting better, meaning I became better at understanding who I was and that it wouldn't get lost. That's all that really mattered. And I could finally leave the couch where I was sleeping for a month, going back to bed, because your brain is all garbled up. But understanding my speech, once I recorded and I listened, it still sounded fine to me. So it really wasn't until I had them transcribed, and that took years for me to really see what it was I was saying now, years before, that did or didn't make the sense I wanted them to be. Not that I was conscious, you remain unconscious for a long time. As your body is getting better and your brain is getting better, you're still various levels of awareness going forward, but never to say until you get to a certain point when you realize, oh, I am now fully confident of what I was saying that was wrong. I could actually see that it was wrong. I could actually correct that sometimes on the fly. Or when you tell me, Jen, you say, oh, Tom, you missed this. I go, oh, I thought I heard that. Thank you for telling me. That takes a long, long time, years, before you can reach that kind of competence.
Right. And someone in our chat also mentioned practice, practice, practice. Our next question is, how long was your stroke?
How long was my stroke?
Well, I guess how long ago was your stroke?
Oh, 10 years ago. 10 years ago was my first stroke. 10 years.
Great. I also want to mention that, as Tom said, everyone has a different journey. And so even though it's very difficult to not compare yourself to others, just remember that everyone's on their own unique path. Okay, let's see. So you talked about the ABCs of stroke, but you also have the Stroke Diary series. You did talk a little bit about it, but can you tell us a little bit more about it? Are those books exactly what you were writing when you were in the thick of your recovery, or are they edited?
Oh, they weren't edited. And what I mean is that a lot of the book, volume 1, describes my experience and that of my family moving forward. So I had all the emails and texts from my kids and my wife, and I saved all of those. They saved them and gave them to me. And then you'll see them in the book. So then you can actually see, there was one particular set of texts back and forth from all the kids and my mom, my wife, of each of them saying, oh, what's happening with dad? Oh, he's not saying this. Oh, he understands that. He doesn't understand that. You could see them all coming together with me basically saying words that didn't make any sense. Because even then, I could still use my computer, and they said things, and I tried to say things and they didn't make any sense. So thank goodness I didn't do too much of that. But you can get all that feedback from them. So that wasn't edited. And then when I was writing in my diary, that started in October of 2011, I was writing with words that didn't make any sense. You'll see the facsimile of all of that, meaning the copy of all of those. So you can read the individual words that I was writing. They don't make any sense, but you'll also see the graphs and metaphorical drawings. You go, oh, that's what Tom was thinking. You'll actually look at that and you say, oh, I can tell what Tom is thinking based on these pictures I was making, but the words won't make any sense. So you get to see that all the way through to 11 months when, as I mentioned before, when I really felt that click in my head, knew something was going on, went back and looked at my first entry, and I'd read them almost every day and pointed, and I said, who wrote that? It looks awful. And then I realized, oh, I did that. And at that point, I realized, oh, that's a whole thing to me of understanding what I had or hadn't been doing for such a long time. Clearly, I was an experiment that somebody put me in that box. Of course, they didn't know that I put myself in that box, did all that work, and never knew until I came up with the evidence. And that was book one. Book two, yeah, I could go on, and I know we're running out of time there too, but so that's book one. Book two is very important, The Secret, it's all about the doing. But you can go on with more questions, I'm sure.
Yeah, we have loads of questions. So you've had your you've had 3 strokes, correct?
Yes, correct.
Across that period, did you see any progress in aphasia awareness and with the amount of information you were getting from the hospital?
You mean at the second, third strokes?
Yes.
You mean? So those 2 TIAs were 2 years after my original stroke. By then, I was at that hospital in Florida. I knew everybody there, including all the SLPs. So when I showed up, well, when I had the SLP, when I had the TIA, my wife and I were unpacking from a big speaking trip I was doing around the country, and I was right next to my wife, and I thought I stumbled, and with the next stumble, I realized, I could feel darkness in my brain. I felt it coming. I thought, oh, this sounds like a stroke. And I fell into a chair, and I had one word. I said to my wife, trouble. And I fell down on the chair. I stayed awake. I was still conscious. And I sat there. She said, are you having a stroke? And I said, uh-huh. And she called 911. And I stayed there, and the ambulance came, and they came and got me and said, can you walk? And I said, uh-huh. And they walked me to the ambulance and took me to the hospital. And in my little brain, I was thinking, all I want is a TPA, because that's all I knew, right? So I kept looking at the clock and kept saying to myself and to my wife, although I don't think I could say it, but I was saying, 3 hours, and I wanted TPA, and they continued to tell me, said, no, you have a TIA, you can't get the TPA. And I was somewhat distraught. But at 3 hours went by, I said, okay, explain it all to me going forward. But I did ask immediately, did I get another composition book so I could start writing and see if I could now write. My wife got it right away, and I could still write, but it was jaggy and off the lines. So I said, okay, at least I can write. Then obviously, then it's more physical. And it took me 2 more weeks while writing and got back to more smoothed articulation. But yeah, so that was the beginning of what a TIA was like. But at least it gave me the goalpost of what it feels like to have one stroke and then another stroke. And I was unconscious enough that I couldn't understand the word outside. TIA, I was conscious enough because I could still see and move as directed.
Thank you for that. Do you have any suggestions for those who want to write but physically can't?
Well, if they want to write and physically can't, well, sort of bump that up to the next question is, any number of people want to do any number of things, and they want to know how they can do those things, whatever they might be. I think that for all of us who assert that question, then typically that person is motivated enough to even ask that question. So when it comes to what the SLPs continue to refer to all of us as the 5 rules of aphasia recovery, number 1 is motivation. That's the silver bullet that can't be found. It has to be found inside of you. So clearly, anybody in the room, like I referred to, anybody in the room who asks that question, what else can I do to get better or write a book or do these things? Even just asking the question means you're motivated. And once you're motivated, then that provides you with all the skills, as damaged as they might be at the beginning, to take all the right steps forward. And number 2 is practice. So if you want to write a book and still can't, there are lots of other ways, of course, even voicing it to others, and they can write that down too. But on various movies we've seen that are amazing, how people actually write a book based on even just the flash of their eyes, you know, A, B, C, D, writing it down. So there's lots of different ways. But I applaud the person who asked that question, because clearly you're motivated enough to find other people who have had these kinds of issues, wrote a book or other things, and you become part of that team and say, what can we all do as we all continue to move forward? So I do appreciate that, what that person said.
I do want to talk a little bit more about that, but first I'd like to ask this question from our Q&A chat. Do you feel fatigue, especially after presentations such as this?
Well, at the beginning of stroke and aphasia, at the beginning of stroke, people, their body is incredibly tired. Even as you get older, you'll continue to get tired, maybe not as tired, but then you have other intervening health, not even issues, but as 10 years forward, now I'm almost 70 versus almost 60, you get tired in other ways, but they all come together with the other stroke-related activities. So yeah, we all get tired as we get older, but not so much in particular just because of this presentation versus the fact that it's just getting late in the day.
Great. So let's go back to writing, because we actually had this conversation in today's book club. What were some of the more challenging barriers for you returning to work or starting to write a book?
Well, returning to work, well, I never could return to work. So I was the associate dean, and it took, well, it took as long as it took. It took 11 months. It took longer than that. I wasn't going to come back as a dean. As, quote, as good as I was getting, I still didn't have the speed, the cognitive speed to be able to move and adjust. I couldn't listen on the phone, which you have to do a lot as an admission director. To this day, if you were calling me and asking anything relatively normal, I would end up having to say, please give me one letter at a time. So by phone, it's still very difficult to write things down. Having this conversation by Zoom, if you were trying to write chat questions while talking with you, taking minutes, I'll get 1 or 2 words. Can't keep up with what I used to do before. So those are just part of the issue you have to continue to work with going forward. Yeah.
So when it came to putting together your first book, what did you need to do for yourself? Well, I guess not the stroke diaries, but the ABCs of stroke, for example. What did you need to do for yourself to get to a place where you felt like that was something that you could do? I think a lot of people in general struggle with writer's block and feelings of insecurity and procrastination. So what was that like for you, and how did aphasia play a role in that?
Well, it's almost as if you're asking me as an author, like other normal people without stroke and aphasia are asking that question, because they have writer's block and they have all those kinds of issues that they all have, as if now it's sort of what I would also have. And I wouldn't say it's really not the case. I think what I was thinking of was that I was trying to figure out how I could help other people with aphasia. And I figured I could write a book, even though I've never written a book before other than my dissertation. But it takes a lot of motivation to write a book. And I've always been trying to figure out how it was that I've ever been motivated before in my life. And then after my stroke, realizing that an awful lot of all of us with stroke and aphasia, how we do after our stroke has a lot to do with who we were before the stroke, right? So it's not like you were motivated for your whole life doing all these things, have a stroke, and on the other side, yes, you can be depressed, yes, you can be emotionally fraught. There's all these other things. However, if you were motivated before and you start to move forward, you're likely moving based on the motive force that came about before your stroke, because still, even though you lost a lot of your cells, again, it does understand how many severe it has been, how many cells have been destroyed. But given all of that, there's still an awful lot of you there. And given that you're still there and the remaining healthy cells that are there, they already say, hey, boss, tell me what to do. These are my cells. They can create more brain matter just by doing the activities used to do. So I think in my case, because it was my habit to keep track of my life, so I do a lot of that kind of extra work just to keep track. And when I started writing the book and had saved all this evidence, I thought, well, I should just do what I used to do, which really, since I did my dissertation, when I got my research PhD late in life, it was only 5 years before my stroke. So I was still already, energized to do the next big test, whatever it would be. It just turned out that it was getting better from stroke and aphasia. That turned out to be the big test.
Thank you for that. We have another question in our Q&A chat. Do you speak other languages?
I only English.
We have a question in our regular chat. My neurologist says that my MRI and scan don't show any evidence of a stroke, but I still talk with a slow cadence, but I can sing in time. What should I do for speech therapy or pathology?
Well, other than talking with your local speech language pathology, I mean, other than the neurologist, the next step, if you haven't already, would be talking with your speech therapist in terms of any number of things they might suggest. From my perspective, whatever is going on, it still has an awful lot to do with the cognitive activities that has to be exercised on a day-to-day basis. So that if it's reading, writing, and speaking that have all been somewhat impaired, you have to continue doing them badly on your way to getting them better. So even just, you can do all those other things, but today you know that to make it get better, you just have to practice with those muscles, the neuromuscles, in order for them to get better.
Another question we have is, what should people with aphasia do that was not triggered by a stroke, but by TBI, concussion, sports, etc.?
Okay, so I'm reading here. What should people do what was not triggered by a stroke? Well, then there'll be again, the brain is such an amazing device. The acquired aphasia that comes as a result of a stroke is one particular kind of foundation to the loss of your language. If you come not by a stroke, but by other damage activities, TBI, concussion, and so on, then they have other kinds of underlying conditions that lead to the quote loss of language or difficult with language and so on. And I'm not sure which one of those are triggered not by the stroke but by these other activities, and are they lost cells, or are they damaged cells, or are they otherwise latent cells such that they just don't know what to do yet? I don't know those things. Looking at those words on the screen, again, your SLP and other people even beyond that are the ones that can help you with TBI and concussions and sports and those kinds of things. Yeah, because it's quite more difficult, not more difficult, but it is difficult.
Thank you for that. So you mentioned that when a person had a stroke, you would be there at the hospital the next day to talk to families. How did you start that type of work? Because I know a lot of people in our audience kind of want to start to go back into volunteer work or aphasia advocacy. So can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, sure. When I was still in Boston before going to Florida, but we were moving, I I really wanted to become a volunteer at the local hospital. I was at my hospital, my rehab hospital, 92 times in 9 months. So I was there for everything from SLP, PT, OT, neurologist, everything, 92 times. And you get to know people, right? You get to know the people at the front desk, you get to know these people, and they had volunteers. So I got to meet them and say, I want to be like you, except we're moving. And they said, well, you could continue to do that and send an application when you send it, even now, before you even get there. So that's what I did. And they had, at that hospital, they had a person with stroke and aphasia volunteer. And that his name was David Brown, I think. He was part of a group because he had stroke and aphasia. He was there. Anyway, I said, I want to be like him. By the time I got there, he had left and they didn't have that job anymore, but they had other jobs. So I took the job and started learning more about the hospital that way. But yes, that was a lot of help to be a volunteer. And then once I finally told them that I had this thing called aphasia and was getting better, I said, can I come and speak to the group? And they said, sure, and that was really how I started understanding that I could help in that way.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions and only a few more minutes, but how long to recuperate from a stroke? 6 months, 12 months, longer?
Yeah. And the answer is, we're not going to tell you the answer. It's going to take as long as it's going to take. For those who think that I'm somehow perfect, I'm not. I still have plenty of lingering deficits. I continue to practice them all my life. So all of us know now that there is no deadline. The plan isn't a plan with a deadline. The plan is a plan, and the plan to continue to do what you've been doing for the rest of your life. You have to figure this out and do that forever. So I know even my family was always asking to the nurses, how long, how long, how long, how long, how long? And eventually somebody said, well, 6 months. And 6 months came and went. You'll get to know what the trajectory looks like as you save the evidence, or at least use the evidence that you can otherwise provide, and begin to see what that trajectory looks like going forward as you improve, as slow or as fast as you think you are.
Thank you. We have a question from Martina B. Is it possible that we, people with aphasia, can download your book, ABC of Aphasia, Stroke Primer? Please, can you provide a link to your website and for the resources that you recommend to read? Thank you.
My website is there, I think, Stroke Educator.
Yep. I'm going to put it in the chat box again. I believe Martina had also asked about joining a mailing list, and I just want to let everyone know that at the bottom of strokeeducator.com, there is a sign up for a newsletter. We also have that for aphasia.org, and you could always email me, jen@aphasia.org, to join any mailing list. Martina, I think you already are on our mailing list, but I'll double check. Yes, so
if you sign up on mine, and you should do that quickly because today is Thursday, my 10th anniversary of my stroke is this coming Sunday. So I'll be releasing a video and an article on Sunday that you will get if you get it to me, and I'll put it on the list. Otherwise, I'll get it later, and I'll make sure I get it to you later. But that way you get to see everything I have. Somebody had asked about my book download through Kindle. You can get all my books through Kindle on Amazon. So you can do that for sure. And I do see it working. So that's working.
My next question is, do you struggle with short-term or long-term memory loss?
When I used to think it was short-term memory, it could be more working memory. I know the scientists know all these different ways of describing how our brain works. But yes, I still have issues like that. Typically has to do with what I call short-term memory or working memory when it comes to attempting to write down something on by phone. If I'm talking to Sears and they're saying, okay, Tom, here's this, 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 and this, I mean, oh my God. So I have to tell them, please slow down, and help me get through this. But by doing that, I can continue to learn by having them giving me the feedback as they do it more slowly. So yes, even that, I'll call it short-term memory. I'm not really sure what, except for the fact that the brain cannot quite absorb the information while the next set of information is already hitting itself. So it becomes one of my articles is in my website that talks about that component of it.
Thank you so much for that. We are actually at the end of our session. We have some really nice messages for you, Tom, in the chat box.
Thank you.
But to our wonderful audience, if your question was not answered today, we'll probably be bringing it up at a future Ask the Expert. If you have questions directly for Tom, I believe he entered his email into the chat. Tom, do you mind just putting that back in the chat again?
Sorry?
Do you mind putting your email back into the chat again?
Oh, sure. And do I get to see the all the chats? Do I get to see them?
You know what? I'm not 100% sure, but I can stay on here so you can read them all.
Oh, right. I'm gonna stop.
Let me quickly share my screen with everyone because I do have a few things to share with you guys.
Hopefully it just got out there.
So we have a few upcoming Ask the Expert webinars. On October 7th, a conversation about apraxia, and that's with the president of the National Aphasia Association. On October 21st, we have a conversation with Deborah Meyerson, who wrote the book Identity Theft, which is one of the books that Tom brought up a little bit earlier. There we go. On November 4th, we have a conversation about aphasia and technology with Brooke Hatfield, who is a wonderful speech language pathologist. We also have some really amazing online groups. I know Martina was asking about them a little bit earlier. On Monday, every other Monday, we have Work Out Your Words, which is a workout session that meets every other Monday. We have a new group. We're on to our second session next week. It's called Game Time. It's a game club that meets every Tuesday. That's where we play games like bingo and word games. It's just a fun thing to do. Every Thursday, we have Books, Us and More, which is the National Aphasia Association's book club. We are just finishing our last book. So if you'd like to join the new book, for the new book, you should just email me at jen@aphasia.org. And then finally, we have Professionals with Aphasia Connect. And that's a peer-led conversation group for people with aphasia. This group is about people who are working or returning to work. And that meets one Friday of every month. Again, on your screen, we have Dr. Broussard's website, strokeeducator.com. You can find more information at aphasia.org/online-events. You could also find information on future Ask the Expert webinars and pre-submit any questions you have for any of our future experts. Thank you guys so much for joining us today and submitting so many great questions. It was really a fun conversation to have. I appreciate that we're all learning and that we're all learning together. So thank you so much for being here. I really hope to see you at the next one. Thank you and take care.
Thank you. Thank you all.